The sun baked the narrow dirt paths of Kijiji-Wajua, a forgotten village nestled at the edge of the dry plains, where acacia trees twisted like ancient secrets and every gust of wind carried a whisper of someone else's business. Here, houses were built of mud and woven grass, their roofs patched with old metal scraps and hope. Life moved slowly under the weight of tradition. Every action, every word, was judged, not by law, but by eyes that never blinked and tongues that never tired. It was a village where the past walked beside the living, where the names of ancestors echoed louder than the cries of children. Zuleika walked through these dusty roads with her head held high, even when her slippers were worn thin and her stomach knotted with hunger. She was the daughter of a fisherman who had not touched the lake in over a month, too sick to lift even a net. Her mother, once a lively singer at weddings, now sat silently on a mat each evening, folding her hands and staring into the growing dark. Zuleika was 17 when her father first fell ill, and by 22, she had taken on the full weight of their survival. She cleaned neighbors' courtyards, gathered wood from the hills, and sold woven mats in the market, all while refusing to beg. Pride was her last possession, and she guarded it fiercely. But pride did not pay debts. And the debts had grown. A loan for medicine, another for her father's transport to the distant clinic, food borrowed on credit, and promises to pay back with a future that never came. At night, she listened to her father coughing until dawn, and her mother sighing in silence beside the fire. One evening, just as the sun dipped behind the trees, an old woman appeared at their door. She wore a faded shawl embroidered with unfamiliar patterns, and her eyes were sharp like flint. She didn't offer her name, just sat on a stool and spoke as if she already knew the answers to every question. "There is a man," she said, stirring her tea slowly. "He wishes to marry a good-hearted woman. He has seen Zuleika. If she agrees, all your debts will vanish by morning." Zuleika stiffened. The offer was disgusting. She wasn't for sale. "I don't even know who he is," she snapped. "I'm not some prize goat to be traded." The old woman smiled, slow and thin. "Then perhaps your father will die before the rains come. Your mother will beg at the mosque gates. You will live with shame, or die with your pride." When the woman left, the room was heavy with silence. Her mother turned her face away, but Zuleika saw the tear roll down her cheek. That night, by the dying fire, her mother's words struck deeper than any insult from the village women ever had. "Pride cannot be boiled into soup, Zuleika. You are my only hope to save this family." Zuleika said nothing. She stared at the crackling embers and bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted blood. The morning of the wedding came with no joy. No singing women, no drums echoing across the hills, no scent of slow-roasted goat or the laughter of curious children peeking from behind fences. Instead, a light mist hung over the village like a warning, and the only sounds were the chickens scratching at the dirt and the wind pushing gently through the acacia branches. Zuleika stood inside her mud-walled home, dressed in a borrowed wrapper too large for her small frame. Her mother tied a scarf over her head and avoided her gaze, her hands shaking as she pinned a broken brooch, the only heirloom they had, at her daughter's shoulder. No one spoke. The air between them was thick with unspoken apologies and unbearable tension. Outside, only 5 people gathered near the village's old prayer hut. The imam had been paid a small sum to conduct the nikah in private. 2 men stood as witnesses, both strangers. The third was a woman from the next village who brought water and quickly left. Not even her cousins came. Her best friend, Asha, had looked away the day before, embarrassed by what she called a foolish choice. To marry a man without name or status was worse than spinsterhood in a place like this. Then came the groom. He arrived quietly, on foot, with no procession, no drumming, no family behind him. He wore plain brown trousers and a threadbare cream tunic. A veil of finely woven cloth, not expensive, but unusual, covered his face from the eyes down. His hands were rough but clean. He said nothing as he stood across from her. When asked if he accepted the marriage, he nodded once. His voice was deep but emotionless. "Yes," was all he said. It was the only word he spoke the entire day. Zuleika's heart pounded in her chest. She had tried to stay still, to remain composed, but tears threatened to betray her. She couldn't believe this was her wedding, not the way she had imagined it as a child, not how she dreamed of being celebrated in flowers and laughter. She clenched her fists under the veil draped over her arms. Rage burned in her throat, but shame buried it before it could speak. The ceremony ended in under 20 minutes. No rice was thrown, no ululations were heard. The imam left as quickly as he came, pocketing his payment. Her mother handed her a small cloth bag with a change of clothes and a worn leather pouch of dried nuts. There was no kiss, no blessing, just a final whisper, "May God go with you, daughter." A donkey cart was waiting at the edge of the village. The driver didn't greet her. The groom sat at the back without a word. Zuleika climbed in, and before she could glance back one last time, the cart lurched forward. Dust rose behind them, swallowing the village whole. The road out of Kijiji-Wajua twisted through dry fields and faded memories. Zuleika did not cry. She stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, fingernails digging into her palms. She told herself it was better this way, no one to laugh at her tears. But behind her, laughter did erupt, soft and cruel. Women washing clothes at the river whispered to each other, "She sold herself to save her father. She married a beggar. A faceless man. She'll be back, crying, within a week." At the next village, the cart paused for water. Zuleika heard the whispers again. Children pointed. A man spat near her feet. "That's her," someone said. "The girl who had a ghost." The groom still said nothing. He helped her down from the cart with surprising gentleness. His hands were steady. But she pulled away. She didn't want kindness. Not from him. Not from anyone. She had sacrificed her dignity to save her family. But in the eyes of the world, she was just a girl who had married shame. The donkey cart veered off the main road onto a narrow, unpaved path that vanished into the thick forest. Tall trees loomed on either side, their twisted limbs forming a natural tunnel of shadow and silence. Zuleika's heart sank with every turn, every creak of the cart's wooden frame. She hadn't expected luxury, but she thought there would be something, at least a modest home, a proper courtyard, even a corner of land to call her own. Instead, they seemed to be drifting deeper into nowhere. After more than an hour of quiet travel, the trees opened slightly, revealing a small clearing choked with wild grass and tangled roots. At its center stood a shack, no larger than a cattle shed. Its walls were made of uneven mud bricks, patched in places with woven reeds and mismatched planks of wood. The thatched roof sagged, as if tired from holding on through too many seasons. One of the windows was boarded shut. A goat bleated softly from behind the shack, the only sound to welcome her. "This is it," the man said quietly, his voice as steady as it had been during the wedding. He climbed down first and extended his hand to help her. She ignored it. She stepped down slowly, her feet landing in the overgrown weeds. She looked around, no neighbors, no other houses, just the forest watching in silence. Smoke drifted lazily from a crooked chimney. The garden beside the shack looked half-kept, half-forgotten, rows of cassava and maize sprouting unevenly between weeds. A broken gourd hung from a tree, probably once used to scare birds away. Everything was rough, simple, and deeply disappointing. This is your home?" she asked, voice brittle. Amari nodded. "Ours, now. Ours." The word felt like a slap. She entered the hut and stood frozen. The inside was cramped and dark, lit only by a small oil lamp placed on a wooden crate. A bed made of woven rope sagged in the corner. A clay pot bubbled gently over a fire pit in the ground. A cracked mirror leaned against the far wall. There was no furniture to speak of, only a few utensils stacked neatly in a corner and bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Zuleika swallowed her anger, but it burned in her stomach. They had promised she'd be marrying someone who could at least take care of her. Someone stable, someone with land, someone who wouldn't make her feel like she had been thrown away into the forest like a secret. She had been forced into this marriage to save her family, and now she was stranded in a place even the birds seemed to avoid. She dropped her small cloth bag onto the floor and sat stiffly on the edge of the bed. "Is there water?" she asked without looking at him. He nodded again. "I'll bring some." Then he was gone. She waited in silence, listening to the trees creak outside. Somewhere in the distance, a hyena called out. The hut felt like a trap, like a cage built from expectations and failure. When Amari returned, he handed her a gourd filled with cold spring water. She drank it quickly, not thanking him. The next morning began without instruction. Amari was already outside, tending to the garden, a hoe in his hand and sweat on his brow. He wore the same clothes, patched and faded. He didn't ask her to help, but Zuleika felt the weight of boredom closing in. With nothing else to do, she began cleaning the inside of the hut, brushing away dust, organizing the few possessions, boiling water for tea. She did it not out of duty, but from an uneasy restlessness that made sitting still unbearable. The days turned into a rhythm she despised. Amari rose before dawn, often leaving the hut without a word. Some mornings he returned by breakfast, other times he didn't appear until dusk. He would come back with firewood, bundles of medicinal herbs, sometimes fresh vegetables he hadn't grown in the garden. When she asked where he'd been, he simply replied, "There are things to do." He never shouted. Never raised a hand. Never made demands. But he kept his distance. When they ate, they sat quietly. When night fell, he slept on a woven mat on the floor and let her have the bed. There was no touch, no closeness, not even the awkwardness of newlyweds learning to share space. It was as if he had built a wall between them out of silence. Zuleika began to resent him even more for it. She had been forced into this life, yes, but why did he act as if he were the one wronged? She scrubbed the pots harder, slammed the water pot on the ground, walked noisily across the wooden planks of the floor, hoping he'd react. He never did. Just a quiet glance, sometimes a faint smile that made her angrier. She worked to keep the place livable, but her heart remained cold. The garden needed constant care. The hut needed repairs. The fire pit had to be cleaned, the goats fed. She did all of it with a bitterness that clung to her like sweat. This was not the life she had imagined. This was not the life they had promised her. And yet here she was, cut off from the world, tethered to a man she didn't understand, trapped in a forest shack that felt more like punishment than salvation. The forest was never quiet, not really. Even when the wind paused and the animals fell still, there was always a whisper in the leaves, a hum in the trees that sounded like the past breathing through the roots. Zuleika had begun to notice these sounds more each day, especially as the days stretched into weeks and the silence between her and Amari deepened. One afternoon, she went to fetch water from the spring at the edge of the forest. A group of children from a nearby homestead was playing there, barefoot, wild-haired, laughing as they chased each other with sticks pretending to be spears. When they noticed her, they quieted, watching her with wide eyes. One of them, a bold girl no older than 10, stepped forward and tugged at Zuleika's shawl. "You live with the ghost?" she asked, not with fear, but curiosity. Zuleika frowned. "What ghost?" "The man in the woods. People say he walks at night and disappears into the rocks. Some say he leaves gold under mango trees for the hungry. Mama says he's cursed, but Auntie says he's an angel." Zuleika laughed a little, despite herself. "Ghosts don't farm cassava," she said, shaking her head. But the children's words lingered with her long after they ran off. That night, as Amari returned late again, with mud on his hands and a small pouch of dried herbs slung over his shoulder, she watched him more closely. He moved like someone who had nothing to hide, but lived like someone with many secrets. The next day, she asked him directly, while they shared roasted yams beneath the mango tree. "Do you know anything about these stories? About a ghost who leaves gold for the poor?" Amari smiled, chewing slowly. "Children believe what makes life more magical." "Do you disappear into the rocks at night too?" she teased, but there was tension behind her words. "Only to escape your sharp tongue," he said, chuckling lightly. Then, as usual, he fell silent. The answer didn't satisfy her. Something gnawed at her thoughts. The way he returned late some nights with things he couldn't have grown or foraged. The way he always kept the same tattered clothes, yet never ran out of tea leaves or salt. The faint scent of perfume she once noticed on his scarf, too fine for a farmer's life. One morning, while cleaning out the goat pen, she discovered something strange. The animals had knocked over a pile of old branches stacked against the back wall. Behind them, buried in the dirt, was a rusted iron box with a thick leather strap binding it shut. It was heavy. She dragged it out, heart pounding, her fingers trembling as she pried at the lock. It didn't open easily, but the hinges finally gave with a metallic groan. Inside lay things that didn't belong in a forest shack. Silks and satins folded into precise bundles, colors so rich they shimmered even in the dim light. Rolls of gold-threaded cloth, the kind worn by wealthy traders or royal messengers. A handful of foreign coins, gold, silver, some with markings she couldn't even read. At the bottom, wrapped in oilskin, was a polished ring with a sapphire that seemed to glow. Zuleika stared at it all, her mind racing. Who was this man she had married? Suddenly, a shadow fell across the pen. "What are you doing?" She turned sharply. Amari stood at the entrance, his face darker than she'd ever seen it. Not angry, exactly, but wounded, as if something precious had been exposed. He walked in slowly, picked up the silk scarf at the top of the pile, and folded it again with care. "You lied to me," Zuleika said, breathless with disbelief. "You're not some poor farmer. You have wealth. You live like a ghost in rags while I sleep hungry and wear torn wrappers." Amari didn't raise his voice. "I never lied. I just never told you." She stepped toward him, furious. "Why? Why would someone with gold and silk choose to live like this? Why bring me into your broken shack? Why make me suffer?" He looked at her then, not with anger, but with something heavier, something sad. "Because truth," he said softly, "is a burden we both aren't ready for." Zuleika's hands clenched at her sides. "Try me." But he said nothing more. He locked the trunk, lifted it onto his shoulder, and carried it deep into the forest. She didn't follow him. When he returned that evening, the trunk was gone, and so was the easy quiet that had settled between them in recent weeks. From that day on, she watched the trees more closely. She listened to the whispers. She waited, not knowing if she was married to a liar, a ghost, or a man who had buried himself in secrets so deep they couldn't be dug out by hand. The rains never came that season. The clouds drifted above like taunts, gray-bellied, full, but unwilling to spill. The rivers thinned to trickles, and the wells grew shallow. Chickens died in their coops, goats wandered farther into the brush, desperate for anything green. The sun cracked the earth like glass under pressure, and the village felt it, in their hunger, in their silence, in the way they began to pray louder at dusk. Zuleika watched as the drought hollowed everything. Children stopped laughing. Women's eyes looked distant when they fetched dry buckets. Meals shrunk to boiled roots, sometimes only once a day. The forest became quieter than ever, as though even the animals had given up hope. Yet somehow, impossibly, her own hut remained steady. Her small garden, once struggling, now bore enough to feed them both. She noticed Amari watering it every morning, sometimes even at night, drawing water from a mysterious jug that never seemed to empty. Then stranger things began to happen. Bundles of food, dried fish, maize, even bags of rice, began appearing on the doorsteps of neighbors in the nearby villages. Always at night. No one knew where it came from. The rumors flared again. The ghost, children said. The forest prince, some whispered in secret. Zuleika stayed silent, but her suspicions grew. One evening, just past midnight, she noticed Amari wasn't beside the dying fire. She waited. Then followed. Moonlight poured through the treetops, silvery and soft, but still enough to see by. She walked barefoot, careful to make no sound as she trailed his figure deeper into the forest. He was walking fast but purposefully, and she kept just far enough to avoid being seen. After some time, he reached a small clearing she had never seen before, stone-ringed and lit by torches that burned blue instead of orange. Figures emerged from the shadows. 5, maybe 6. All cloaked, heads bowed. Amari stepped forward. But he wasn't the man she lived with. Not the one who patched his clothes and dug cassava. He wore deep crimson robes that shimmered like woven blood. Gold embroidery laced his cuffs and neckline. A wide sash of royal blue clung around his waist, and on his head rested a thin, twisted crown of hammered bronze. Zuleika's breath caught in her throat. She crouched low, hidden behind a thick shrub, her heart hammering. One of the cloaked figures stepped forward and knelt. "My prince," the voice rang, reverent, deep. "The elders await your word. Shall we break silence?" Amari, or whoever he was, lifted his hand. "Not yet," he said. "Not until the time is right. Let them believe in shadows for now. Let hunger soften their pride." Another cloaked man spoke. "And your wife, your highness? Does she suspect?" He paused. "She asks questions. She is stubborn. But no, she doesn't know the truth." Zuleika couldn't breathe. Every memory, every moment she had scrubbed floors, eaten stale yams, cried from shame, rushed through her all at once. A prince? A royal? And he let me think he was nothing? Her legs gave way. She gasped. The figures turned. Amari's eyes locked onto the darkness. Zuleika. That was the last thing she heard before everything went black. She woke in her bed at dawn. Her clothes were changed, her forehead cool with a wet cloth. The fire had been restarted. Birds chirped outside like it was any other morning. Amari sat quietly near the window, slicing fruit into a bowl. He didn't look at her. "What happened?" she whispered, voice hoarse. "You fainted," he said, as if it meant nothing. "You must have walked in your sleep." She stopped. The memory of the cloaked men, the gold robes, the name Prince echoed in her head like a fever dream. She sat up. "I followed you. I saw." Amari finally looked at her. Calm. Too calm. "You were dreaming." "No. I saw. You've been under the sun too long. The heat does strange things to the mind." She stared at him, stunned by the coldness in his dismissal. "Why are you lying to me?" He set the fruit bowl down and walked toward her, kneeling beside the bed. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "truth is more dangerous than lies. Sometimes, the burden of knowledge crushes those who aren't ready." "You said that before," she whispered. "In the goat pen." He touched her hand gently. "Rest now. You've been ill." And then he stood, as if the conversation had never happened, and continued preparing breakfast as if she were not on the edge of losing her mind. Zuleika lay back, heart racing, her mind spinning with questions that had no safe answers. What had she stumbled into? Who was this man, this stranger with a crown in the shadows? And why had he chosen her to play this cruel game of secrecy? But most of all, what would happen now that she knew? The merchant arrived like most others did, with a rattling cart and a mouth full of tales. His oxen looked thin, but his smile was full. Children ran to greet him, eager for the sweets and trinkets he often brought, and elders nodded as he passed, familiar with his routes. He wasn't just a trader, he was a collector of stories, someone who had walked many dusty paths and listened more than he spoke. Zuleika didn't plan to speak with him at first. She had enough on her mind, too much, really. The memory of Amari dressed in royal red, the cloaked men, the words "my prince" still echoed in her ears. He continued to pretend it had all been a dream, but every quiet glance, every sudden change of subject when she asked questions, confirmed he was hiding something very real. And now, he was gone again, off on one of his strange errands that always ended with goods no farmer should be able to afford. Still, something tugged her to the merchant's camp that evening. He had set up a small stall outside a clay house, laying out woven baskets, beads, dried fruits, and copper rings. People browsed, haggled. Some traded chickens for sugar. Others simply listened as he wove old tales between transactions. Zuleika lingered near the back, unsure what she was even looking for, until the merchant's eyes met hers. "You," he said suddenly, blinking as if recognizing her. "You live in the woods, don't you? With a quiet man?" Her heart thudded. "Yes, why?" He looked around, leaned closer, and lowered his voice. "Is he tall, lean, always walking like he's watching the road behind him?" "Yes." "And when he looks at you," the merchant added, "does it feel like he sees too much?" Zuleika hesitated, then nodded slowly. The merchant smiled, not in mockery, but with something that looked like awe. "Then I'll tell you a story, girl. But you mustn't interrupt." She nodded again, her breath shallow. "Many years ago," he began, "there was a boy born into a house of gold, a palace surrounded by walls so high they kept out not just thieves, but truth. His father was one of the richest men in the country. But rich in the wrong ways. They say the father crushed villages to build his empire, cut down sacred forests, poisoned rivers with his factories, and bribed judges with the blood of laborers." The crowd around the merchant thinned. Only Zuleika stood listening now. "The boy, though," the merchant continued, "he was different. He was quiet, kind. He asked too many questions. They sent him away, to the best schools, far from home, hoping he'd come back molded into the next tyrant. But he didn't." Zuleika felt her spine straighten. When the father died, the boy returned. Not to grieve, but to destroy everything his father built. They say he rejected the inheritance, refused the board meetings, tore up deeds with his own hands. The family cursed him. But before they could reclaim the wealth through lawyers and tricks, he vanished, disappeared without a trace. The merchant lowered his voice. "They say he changed his name, gave away his shares, and began traveling. Alone. Silent. Always helping, but from the shadows. One day he'd leave a water well in a dying village. Another, he'd restore a school under a false name. No one ever saw his face clearly. But those who did say he walked like a man carrying a crown he never wanted." Zuleika was frozen in place. "Once," the merchant added thoughtfully, "I passed through a town near the old mines. There was a clinic, fully funded, new roofs on every home, and the people whispered about a man who came at night with wagons of supplies. They bowed when they mentioned him. Not out of fear. Out of love. I caught a glimpse. Tall. Gentle. Dressed like a nobody." He studied her face. "It's him, isn't it?" Zuleika didn't answer. Her hands trembled at her sides. "You're lucky," he said, gently. "Few people get to see the truth. Fewer still are trusted with it." He turned back to his stall, leaving her stunned. That night, Zuleika couldn't sleep. Her mind raced, chasing the pieces now clicking into place. The respectful way villagers nodded when Amari passed through distant towns. The herbalist in the next village who once called him sir before correcting herself. The constant disappearances. The secret generosity. The gold. The silks. The trunk. The night in the forest. He was no ordinary man. He wasn't even just a prince. He was a man who had set fire to everything he could have claimed, and chosen, instead, to live among those his father had once crushed. Helping not with speeches or parades, but with quiet acts and hidden hands. And now, she was part of that truth. Part of that burden. And maybe, part of his plan. The moon was a perfect silver coin in the sky that night, casting a soft glow over the trees and bathing the small hut in a haunting, dreamlike light. The forest held its breath. Not even the owls dared to hoot, as though the night itself was waiting for something to unfold. Zuleika stood at the edge of the clearing, barefoot, arms wrapped around herself, the wind teasing strands of her hair. She had waited for this night. Waited for the quiet moment when lies would no longer hold and truth would have to answer her call. Amari returned just after midnight, as he always did. A burlap sack over one shoulder, soft dirt clinging to his boots. But tonight, Zuleika stepped directly in his path. "No more stories," she said, voice calm but fierce. "No more games, Amari. Or Prince. Or whoever you are." He paused. His face flickered through confusion, surprise, and then, slowly, acceptance. "I know," she added. "I know you're not who you pretend to be. The merchant told me. But I think I knew long before that." Amari let the bag fall from his shoulder. It landed softly on the earth, and he said nothing for a long while. Only looked at her in the moonlight, as if memorizing her shape, her certainty. Then he stepped forward. "You're not afraid?" he asked quietly. "I've been afraid every day since I married you," she replied. "Afraid of your silence. Afraid of your kindness. Afraid of loving a stranger. But tonight, I just want the truth." Amari exhaled and looked up at the moon. "I was born into fire," he began. "Into a house where gold was more precious than life, and power more sacred than truth. My father ruled the Tembo kingdom not as a king, but as a merchant of souls. He traded people's futures for land. Sold sacred forests to foreigners. Built wealth on graves." Zuleika didn't speak. She only listened. "I was the only son. They said I was born to inherit it all, the factories, the mines, the debt-laced farms. But I saw what my father never did. I saw a boy die of hunger at the gates of our mansion. I saw women walk 50 miles for water, past our fountains that ran all day. I saw the priest we bribed to bless our corruption." His voice cracked, but he pressed on. "One day, during a state tour, I collapsed in a remote village. Fever. No guards. No doctors. Just me, shaking and burning. I should have died." He turned toward her. "But a woman there, a healer, sat beside me for 3 days. Fed me crushed herbs, covered my body in wet leaves, sang lullabies I didn't know. She didn't ask who I was. Didn't care what I owned. She saved me because I was human." Zuleika's eyes burned. "When I woke, I asked her why she helped me. She said, 'The world is sick, but kindness is still a cure.'" He closed his eyes. That moment changed everything. "I returned home, tore up the succession documents, and told my mother and council I would never take the throne unless the kingdom was cleansed of its greed. They called me a traitor. My cousins tried to poison me. One of my own guards held a blade to my neck. I knew then, I couldn't stay. Not as prince. Not as heir. So I left. Disappeared. Hid the wealth I could in secret places, made it untraceable, and began traveling. I help who I can, where I can. I do not rule, I serve." Silence swallowed the forest for a long moment. "And me?" Zuleika finally asked, her voice a whisper. "Why marry me? Why bring me into the secret life? You could have chosen anyone." Amari stepped closer. "When I came to your village, it was to deliver medicine to a dying elder. I saw you at the well. You were standing up to a group of boys mocking a widow for her tattered clothes. You gave her your shawl, even though you had little. You reminded me of a healer. The fire in your eyes. The way you stood for dignity even when you had none left to give." Zuleika turned away, overwhelmed. "So, this was what? A test? A favor? A lesson?" "No," he said softly. "It was hope. I thought, if I could live honestly beside someone like you, maybe I'd still have a soul left to salvage." She turned to him again. "And what now? What am I to you now that I know the truth?" He looked her in the eyes. "Everything. If you'll still choose me." Zuleika's heart beat like thunder in her chest. She thought of all the nights she cursed his silence. All the mornings she cooked with resentment. The secret kindnesses, the soft ways he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. The sleepless nights he spent helping strangers. The man behind the veil, not a prince, not a ghost, but a man burdened by a crown he never wanted. "You should have told me," she whispered. I didn't know if I deserved you, he said. She looked up at the moon again. The light between them was soft, silver, real. From now on, she said, no more secrets. I've lived enough lies to last me a lifetime. Amari nodded. Then I'll tell you everything. And as the moon watched, the forest exhaled, and the truth bloomed, finally, between them. The sun was heavy that morning, casting thick heat across the clearing and making the trees stand tall in stillness. Zuleika had just finished watering the herbs Amari planted near the back of their hut when the sound of crunching gravel and distant voices pricked at her ears. It wasn't the sound of animals or villagers gathering, it was deliberate, heavy footsteps. More than one. Too loud. Too close. She stood still, eyes scanning the narrow path leading to their home beyond the forest. Then she saw them. 6 men. Her uncle among them. He walked in front, dressed as if he owned land and reputation, though Zuleika knew better. Behind him came 5 thugs, thick-bodied, eyes twitching like jackals, city men, not used to quiet places. They wore leather belts and carried sticks, though some had knives hidden beneath their robes. Zuleika's breath caught. She hadn't seen her uncle since the wedding, when he refused to attend because marrying a beggar was an embarrassment. His sudden arrival now, with muscle behind him, was no coincidence. Amari stepped out of the hut just then, calm as ever, a wooden bowl still in his hand. The uncle's voice rang out, falsely cheerful. Niece! You've grown soft with luxury, I see. Zuleika didn't answer. Amari's eyes narrowed. The uncle pointed to him. You. The mystery man. I know what you've been hiding. The whole village whispers now, coins falling from the sky, food appearing in the drought, and my niece living in silk while her blood family scrapes by. He spat. I've come to correct the mistake. She'll come with me now. And you, he nodded at the thugs, you'll hand over whatever's left in that hut. Zuleika's fists clenched. You have no right. Her uncle interrupted. I have every right. I raised you after your father died. That dowry wasn't enough to settle what your family owes me. She owes you nothing, Amari said quietly, stepping forward. The thugs chuckled. One cracked his knuckles. The uncle sneered. And who are you to say so? You think your vales and woods can protect you? I'm telling you once, Amari replied, voice calm as still water. Turn around. Leave while you still have dignity. Or what? The uncle laughed. You'll call the goats to fight for you? The moment hung in the air. The wind shifted. And then, from the trees, silent as shadows, emerged a dozen men in dark green and gold. Camouflaged in forest colors, faces painted, weapons tucked against their bodies. They stepped into view like ghosts materializing from mist. Trained. Deadly. Royal guards. The thugs stumbled back, eyes wide. One dropped his stick. Another cursed under his breath. Zuleika's uncle took one step backward, then froze. Amari didn't even flinch. The leader of the guards stepped forward and bowed slightly to Amari. We've been monitoring as instructed, Your Highness. Shall we proceed? Zuleika's uncle looked between the guard and Amari, disbelief washing over his face. Your Highness, he stammered. Amari turned toward him, expression unreadable. I warned you. Then he addressed the guards without raising his voice. No harm. Escort them back to the main road. Let them walk. No rides. The guards moved forward, swiftly surrounding the thugs. One of them whimpered. Another tried to run but was stopped with a firm grip on his shoulder. Zuleika's uncle, trembling now, looked at her. Niece, he pleaded, you've always been soft-hearted. Tell him I was just trying to help. Zuleika stared at him, memories rising like bile, of the way he used her father's debt as a leash, of the meals she missed while he drank imported spirits, of the bruises her mother hid and the silence he forced on them. You never helped us, she said. You only took. He was gone minutes later, dragged away between royalty and justice. When the forest was still again, Zuleika looked at Amari. "You never told me there were guards in the trees." "You never asked," he said softly, smiling just a little. "I don't use them unless I must. But I protect what matters." Zuleika exhaled slowly, the tension finally breaking. For the first time, she saw him not just as the mysterious man, or the runaway prince, but as a protector, quiet and fierce, not with weapons or threats, but with restraint, wisdom, and the kind of power that didn't need to shout. And in that moment, she realized, she was no longer just a village girl. She was the wife of a man who commanded an invisible kingdom. And she would never bow to fear again. The morning came with a messenger, an unfamiliar horseman cloaked in deep blue, bearing a sealed scroll trimmed with gold. The emblem on the wax, though faded by dust and time, was unmistakable, the royal crest of Tembo Kingdom. Amari's face grew still the moment he saw it, like a tide pulling back from shore before the wave returns. He opened it in silence, eyes moving from word to word, and when he finished, he quietly folded the scroll and slipped it into his pocket. Zuleika watched from the doorway, heart sinking. She had seen that look only once before, the night he had finally told her who he truly was. A look that held centuries in its silence. "What is it?" she asked. He turned slowly to face her, eyes unreadable. "My brother is dead." She said nothing at first. The weight of those words hovered in the air. Amari's brother, the crown prince, the heir to the throne. The one who had stayed behind when Amari fled the palace. His death could only mean one thing. "You're next," she said quietly. Amari nodded once. "The council demands my return. They say the kingdom must not fall into chaos. They want me to take the crown." Zuleika sat down slowly, the earth beneath her suddenly too vast and unstable. She had always known the truth might call Amari back to the world he abandoned. But she hadn't expected it so soon, or with such finality. A king. A crown. A kingdom far from their forest, their hut, their quiet rhythm of life. Her voice was barely audible. "So you'll leave?" Amari walked toward her, crouching to meet her gaze. "Not unless you come with me." Her eyes widened. He continued, "I will not return as king unless you stand beside me as queen." The idea struck her like cold water. She, a girl of dusty roads and stone-baked bread, as queen of a kingdom built on gold and silence? It didn't feel real. It felt like a trap, one lined with velvet, but a trap all the same. "I can't," she said, standing and turning away. "I don't belong in a palace. I belong here. With the trees. The wind. The life we built with our hands. I won't survive behind stone walls." "I know," he said behind her. "I felt the same once." She faced him again. "Then why ask me to leave?" "Because they need more than a king," he said softly. "They need the kind of heart you have. The kind that fought to keep her family fed. The kind that gives without expecting gold in return. You were never just a village girl, Zuleika. You were always a queen in exile." Tears welled in her eyes, not from sorrow, but from the unbearable love in his voice. Still, she shook her head. "I can't live in that world. I'll drown there. I can't wear crowns." Amari smiled gently. "Then we won't go to the crown. We bring the crown here." She blinked. "What do you mean?" He reached into his pocket and held out the scroll. "The council expects a king in a palace. But there's no law that says where the throne must be. If the people need a ruler, then let them come to the trees. To the gardens. Let Tembo be ruled not from marble towers, but from soil and sky. You'd give up the palace?" "I already did, the day I chose you." Zuleika stood stunned as the meaning settled into her bones. He would not leave her. He would not abandon the life they'd built in the shadows of trees and stars. Instead, he would rebuild a kingdom in the image of that life, grounded, quiet, alive. She stepped forward, took the letter from his hands, and tore it in half. "Then let the forest be our throne," she whispered. Amari kissed her forehead. And far away, in the capital halls, a kingdom waited for a king. But in the woods, a queen had already been crowned. The day the royals came to the village, the sun rose early, as if summoned by destiny itself. Not a single villager needed waking, the air buzzed with anticipation, with disbelief. For the first time in history, a royal court would arrive not to conquer, not to collect taxes, but to bow. And not to a palace, but to a thatched roof hut wrapped in the arms of the forest. They came in fine silks and long carriages, horses draped in gold-threaded blankets, servants bearing parasols, advisors holding scrolls, diplomats carrying ancient seals. But what they saw upon arrival stopped them in their rehearsed steps. Amari, standing barefoot in the garden, his sleeves rolled up, handing out fruit to children. No fanfare. No trumpet. Just laughter and soil under his nails. Zuleika, meanwhile, sat quietly on the log bench outside their home, watching the trail of approaching royals with equal parts awe and reluctance. She wore no jewels. Just the same indigo cloth dress she'd stitched herself months ago, though someone had woven flowers into her braid. Her eyes, dark and steady, held the strength of someone who'd once walked miles to borrow rice, someone who'd carried her father's fevered body through dust storms without complaint. The villagers gathered quickly. Not from command, but from curiosity. Elders leaned on walking sticks, children ran barefoot through the weeds, and the gossiping aunties wore their finest shawls, whispering, "The queen who cooks her own food. The queen who once scrubbed floors." The ceremony was short by royal standards but eternal in spirit. A low stool carved from an old acacia tree served as the throne. The crown, not a gold diadem, but a hand-woven circlet of vine and silver, crafted by a blind village artisan, was placed gently on Zuleika's head by Amari himself. No trumpets, just the sound of wind brushing through leaves. No hymns, just the villagers humming an old ancestral song once sung during planting season. When Zuleika stood, crown in place, the royal advisors knelt. And so began the rebirth of the kingdom, not from a palace, but from the fields. Amari wasted no time. That same week, engineers were summoned, but not the kind who build towers or golden bridges. These men and women listened first. They sat with the village elders under tamarind trees and asked, "What do your children need?" The answers were simple: water that doesn't sicken the babies. Work that pays fairly. Schools that don't ask for bribes. Within months, the transformation began. The first well was dug near the central square, deep, stone-lined, sealed for hygiene. A water pump painted with children's handprints stood tall above it. Every time someone drew water, they saw the names of the families who once walked 2 miles for a single bucket. Next came the school. Not a gray building of echoing walls, but a long, open structure with bamboo walls, shaded by neem trees. Children who once had no books now studied beside goats and chickens. Amari brought in retired teachers from the capital, who had longed to teach with freedom. Zuleika herself began teaching young girls in the afternoons, reading, counting, and how to speak with courage. Fields that once yielded barely enough to survive were transformed with tools and seeds brought from abroad. But no land was taken. No villager was displaced. The produce was sold back to markets through a system designed by Amari's advisors. The profits returned to the farmers. Jobs appeared like wildflowers. Masons, cloth weavers, potters, healers, everyone had a role. Amari created a village fund managed by a council of elders and women, ensuring that no family slipped through the cracks again. But what amazed the villagers most wasn't the changes. It was how the heart of the village remained untouched. The gossiping continued. The music still rose on full moon nights. Children still jumped into the stream in their underwear, and the elders still napped under trees at midday. And Zuleika? She still made her own bread, still swept her own floor, and still paused to braid the neighbor girl's hair when asked. Foreign officials began visiting, not just to meet the forest king, but to study his model. A decentralized kingdom, governed by dignity, rooted in ancestral land, and led by a woman who refused to trade her simplicity for jewels. Amari never rebuilt his old palace. Instead, he declared the village the new administrative heart of the kingdom. ministers came to hold meetings on mats under mango trees. Royal decrees were carved not into marble, but into wood, nailed to the community tree, where every eye could read them. And at the end of each day, when the sun dipped low and the villagers returned from fields and classrooms and markets, Zuleika and Amari would sit side by side on their log bench, watching the smoke rise from kitchens and the children race toward the sunset. They ruled with hands open, not clenched. And in doing so, they built a kingdom where power did not tower, it rooted. Where a crown did not gleam, it grew. The fire cracked gently in the center of the circle, throwing golden sparks into the night as if scattering stars across the dark sky. The children leaned in closer, faces half-lit and wide-eyed, wrapped in old blankets and youthful curiosity. Their breath clouded in the cool night air as the storyteller, an old man with a cane carved like a serpent, cleared his throat and smiled the way only someone who remembers can. Long ago, he began, there was a girl named Zuleika, born in a village no one remembered, to a family with more debt than rice. She had nothing, no silks, no jewels, not even shoes without holes. But she had pride. And she had fire in her chest, the kind that makes a person walk alone when the whole world tells them to bow. The children giggled, some already knowing the tale, others hearing it for the first time. She was forced to marry a man no one knew. A man who wore torn clothes and walked with no shoes. The villagers laughed. She married a beggar, they said. And maybe she had. But here's the part they didn't understand. He paused, leaning forward. That beggar was once a prince. Gasps and whispers flitted through the children like wind through tall grass. He had left behind palaces filled with lies and gold soaked in blood. He came here, to this very land, to live with honesty and sweat and silence. And though she did not know it at first, Zuleika would one day sit beside him, not on a throne, but on a log, ruling not from above but from among. Behind the storyteller, shadows flickered. A few meters away, beyond the circle of firelight, the silhouette of an older woman stood near the garden path. Her silver hair was tied in a long braid. Her cane was simple wood, worn smooth by decades of use. But her back was still strong. Her eyes still sharp. She watched the children in silence, a half-smile resting on her lips. Zuleika had not vanished into history. She lived it. She taught every day, not through command, but through presence. Girls came to her with broken dreams, bruised hands, and confused hearts. She gave them work, then words, then the truth, that dignity was worth more than dowries. That silence could be louder than shouts. That no one could define your worth unless you handed them the scale. Her hut had grown a bit, but it was still made of mud and wood, shaded by banana leaves. Inside, books lined the walls. Handwritten pages, smudged with ink, filled dozens of bound journals. One in particular sat on a carved wooden stand, a book titled The Shack Beyond the Forest. In it were stories, not of kings and wars, but of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Of quiet revolutions, of meals shared during hunger, of forgiveness earned after cruelty. It became the most read folktale book in the kingdom, because it told truths few were brave enough to speak. Children in faraway cities recited its lines in school assemblies. Girls named their dolls Zuleika. Even royal scrolls sometimes quoted from its pages, true power is the kind that feeds others before itself. And yet, Zuleika never sought fame. She still swept her floors. She still taught girls to write their names and boys to carry water with gratitude. She still sat by the same fire pit every month, listening to stories, correcting exaggerations with a soft laugh. One evening, as dusk settled and the fire storyteller finished retelling the tale, a new child approached the circle. She was not from the village, her clothes too clean, her eyes too unsure. She carried a small cloth sack over one shoulder and wore a crooked smile that tried to hide fear. "Can I listen?" she asked the group. "Of course," the storyteller said kindly. "The story is yours too now." The girl sat, but her gaze drifted to the edge of the circle, to the old woman watching. Their eyes met. Zuleika nodded once. It was the same nod she'd given to Amari the first night they shared bread. The same nod she'd given to the council when they asked her to wear a crown. The same nod she now gave to any soul bold enough to walk away from comfort in search of truth. The girl smiled back. Somewhere deep in the woods, the wind stirred the trees as if remembering something. Amari had passed on seasons ago. His resting place lay beneath the oldest baobab tree, marked not by stone, but by a single brass bowl filled with seeds. A symbol of his life's work, planting what would feed others. And each year, children still visit that tree and leave gifts, coins, feathers, small poems. Zuleika never remarried. "I married once," she would say, "but I married forever." At the fire that night, as the story closed and the flames died down, one child asked the storyteller, "Is she real?" He looked toward Zuleika, who had already begun walking away down the path lined with lanterns and herbs. "She was," he said. Then added softly, "She still is." And somewhere behind the trees, another story began to unfold, because every time someone listens, believes, and chooses courage, the tale of the girl who married a beggar lives on. The kingdom in the field still blooms. The shack beyond the forest still stands. And the woman once laughed at by the world? She taught it how to kneel.